Imagine this. A world-class softball pitcher throwing underhand right from just 43 feet away. The ball's coming in, maybe upper 60s miles per hour. Now picture her facing top Major League Baseball hitters. Guys who are used to seeing, 95 mil per hour fastballs from over 60 feet away. You'd think it's a bit of a mismatch, wouldn't you? That the pros would just, crush that slower pitch from closer in. Well, the source material we looked at kicks off with this absolutely brilliant story about Jenny Finch. When she actually went out to face these big league hitters, some of the infielders on the other team, guys like Aaron Boone from the Yankees, they literally took their gloves off, sat down on the grass, and Hank Blaylock, an all-star from the Texas Rangers, apparently just wandered off to get a drink. They'd seen her warming up, you see, and frankly, they just weren't bothered enough to stand up. Then Barry Bonds steps up, ever the confident one, yeah. He tells Finch he's gonna need a protective screen because he's gonna, quote, touch it hard. And Finch, just cool as anything, apparently replies, there's only been one guy who touched it. Bonds couldn't believe it. Touch it. If it comes across that plate, believe me, I'm gonna touch it. I'm gonna touch it hard. He's insisting she call his people to set up a proper challenge, and she just fires back that her people will call his. He comes back with, oh, it's on. You can call me direct, girl. I take my challenges direct. It's just a fantastic hook, isn't it? It really grabs you because it immediately makes you question your assumptions about performance, and it shows how, different kinds of skill can completely baffle even elite athletes if they're trained for something else. Gets right to the heart of what we're digging into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission is pretty straightforward. You share source material with us, and we dive in deep to pull out the most important bits of knowledge, the surprising insights, the real aha moments. We want to get you properly informed quickly without you having to sift through mountains of information yourself. So today, we're doing a really fascinating deep dive. We've got a stack of sources looking at what actually makes extraordinary athletes tick. We'll explore that, complex mix of biology, environment, sheer hard work, everything that pushes human performance to the edge. And then we'll look at the other side of the coin, how that relentless pursuit affects the body, which leads us into the complex, sometimes quite challenging world of orthopedic sports medicine. And guiding us through all this complex material, we're joined by Prof. Mo Imam. Prof. Imam is brilliant at taking really dense research, boiling it down, and helping us understand not just what the findings are, but, crucially, why they matter in the bigger picture. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's my pleasure. These sources certainly offer a very rich landscape to explore. We're touching on some really fundamental questions about human potential and also the medical challenges that crop up at the extremes of performance.
Excellent. Okay, let's jump straight in then with our rapid fire setup. 3 quick questions, high impact, based on the material you've looked at. First one, based on these sources, is athletic success mainly about nature, your genes? Or is it nurture the practice, the environment?
Well, the sources are pretty clear, actually. It's fundamentally a complex interplay, a real braid, you could say, of both. Neither nature nor nurture on its own seems sufficient to explain elite performance. You absolutely need, it seems, both the right biological starting point and the right environment for that biology to be trained, to be expressed, to reach its highest level.
Okay, so it's definitely both, and crucially, how they interact. Got it. Second question. The source on orthopedic sports medicine, it highlights some pretty significant challenges facing the field today. In your view, what's the single most pressing worry for sports surgeons that comes out of this material?
That's a tough one. It's several critical issues are raised. There are concerns about research reliability, how data is interpreted, even commercial pressures influencing practice. But I think the most stark, perhaps the most existential threat mentioned is the growing problem of antibiotic-resistant microorganisms, superbugs. The possibility of untreatable infections resulting from these could potentially make routine surgical procedures, things like joint replacements, simply too risky to perform safely on a wide scale. That's a profound worry.
Wow, yeah, that is stark. Superbugs making routine surgery unsafe. Okay, final rapid fire question. Technology, it's changing everything, isn't it? Genetic testing, AI. Does this material suggest that the human element in sports, the athletes drive their mental game, the surgeon's intuition, their judgment, is that becoming less important compared to the tech?
Not necessarily less important, perhaps, but its role is certainly changing. It requires adaptation. So while technology like AI offers, remarkable potential improving diagnostic accuracy, automating certain tasks by spotting patterns, the sources seem to imply that surgeons need to actively demonstrate the unique value of their human factor. That could be navigating really complex, unpredictable situations, exercising nuanced judgment that goes beyond algorithms. And for the athlete, their unique biology, their psychological drive, that remains absolutely critical, especially since, as the sources point out, science still only illuminates part of the picture when it comes to understanding individual trainability. Technology is presented more as a powerful tool, something to be embraced and integrated, yeah, but not something that makes the human obsolete, at least not based on the perspectives here.
That's a really interesting overview. So it sounds like we're dealing with this mix of inherent traits, sheer hard work, cutting edge medicine, but also some quite significant challenges on the horizon. Right, let's unpack all of this properly now, starting with that core debate. The ingredients of elite performance, where nature really does meet nurture. We often hear about the 10,000-hour rule, don't we? Popularized by Anders Ericsson. The idea that world-class expertise is basically just down to deliberate, focused practice over a very long time. What do these sources say about practice, about the nurture side of things?
Yes, the sources definitely give significant weight to the importance of practice, specifically deliberate practice. And that's not just mindless repetition, is it? It's structured, intentional effort. You've got clear goals for improvement, often guided by a coach or mentor. Ericsson's original research on elite violinists is sort of the classic reference point here. He tracked practice hours meticulously and found this really striking correlation. The top-tier violinists at a prestigious music academy had, by the time they were 18, racked up significantly more hours of solitary, deliberate practice. We're talking an average of 7,410 hours for them. Compare that to the merely good violinists who had about 5,300 hours. And then students training to be music teachers, they'd only amassed roughly 3,400 hours.
Right. So in that specific context, the sheer volume and presumably the quality of that dedicated practice looked like the key differentiator between the elite and everyone else.
Exactly. And the powerful conclusion from that early work was that this accumulated practice effectively masqueraded as innate musical talent. The difference wasn't seen as some intrinsic ability, but rather the outcome of sustained, focused training. And this idea was then widely applied to sports. The sources talk about how researchers like Janice Starks use similar thinking, employing things like occlusion tests. These tests really challenge the assumption that top athletes are just born with faster raw reaction times. Starks' work suggested instead that elite athletes develop these highly sophisticated, learned perceptual skills.
Perceptual skills. So you mean they learn to anticipate, to read the game, read the opponent better?
Precisely that. Starks' studies, for example, showed elite field hockey and volleyball players could glance at a game situation for just a tiny fraction of a second, literally faster than you can blink, and instantly tell you if a ball was in or out. They could even accurately reconstruct where players were on the field after just a fleeting glimpse. Now, that isn't about how fast you can hit a button when a light flashes. It's about the brain's ability to process complex visual information, recognize patterns, and anticipate what's going to happen next based on vast experience. The sources use the example of the baseball star Albert Pujols. His simple reaction time, only average really 66th percentile compared to college students, but his on-field perceptions reading pitches, anticipating plays that was clearly absolutely elite.
That makes perfect sense. It's not just raw physical speed, it's how quickly your brain interprets what's happening in a really dynamic environment.
Correct. As another researcher, Abernethy, noted in badminton studies, novices might look in the right general direction, say, at the opponent's upper body. But they lack the cognitive database, that huge library of learned patterns and cues built up through thousands of hours of practice to actually extract meaningful information from what they're seeing. Interestingly, telling a good player exactly where to look, like focus on the shoulder, can actually make them perform worse.
Really? Why is that?
Because it interferes with the sophisticated, almost subconscious processing they've developed through all that experience. It's like the classic chess studies by de Groot. They showed a similar thing. Grandmasters could grasp the strategic essence of a chessboard position far more deeply in just 5 seconds than decent CLUD players could in 15 minutes. It wasn't that they were analyzing deeper in that moment necessarily. It was that their years of study had built this vast mental library of recognizable patterns and the best responses associated with them. Quicker, more effective pattern recognition.
Okay, so practice builds this incredible perceptual skill, this cognitive database. That sounds like a really strong case for nurture, for the power of practice. But the sources also throw up quite a few examples that really challenge that simple practice makes perfect narrative. They suggest that the underlying physical hardware you start with is absolutely crucial. What about the nature side? The biology, the innate physical traits?
Yes. This is where the picture gets much more complex, much more nuanced. And it's where the sources provide really compelling evidence that biology isn't just some static baseline. It's an active partner. interacting with the training. The physical characteristics you inherit play a significant role, sometimes an essential one, in determining your potential and shaping how effective your practice actually is.
Right. Let's dig into that physical hardware then. What specific things does the source pull out as being really important?
Well, several key components are mentioned. First, the Achilles tendon. There's research cited from Gary Hunter, illustrating how it functions like a spring. A longer Achilles tendon allows for greater range of motion, and it can store and release more elastic energy during what's called the stretch shortening cycle. Think of kangaroo's powerful hop, it's that kind of mechanism. The source links this directly to sports requiring explosive movements, like high jumping. There's a great anecdote about the high jumper Stefan Holm. Apparently, his father could predict his clearance height just by watching him 4 steps before takeoff.
Wow.
Yeah, it suggests this incredibly consistent, mechanically efficient movement pattern, which is underpinned, presumably, by both his physical structure and his highly trained technique.
The body as a sort of inherent, finely tuned spring. That's fascinating. What other biological factors are highlighted as key?
Muscle fibers are critical. We all have slow twitch fibers, type 1, which are great for endurance, and fast twitch fibers, type 2, which are essential for explosive power and speed. Now, fast twitch fibers not only contract rapidly, they also have a much greater capacity for growth when you do resistance training. They can get significantly bigger than slow twitch fibers. And whilst training can improve speed to some extent, the sources mentioned that old coaches saying, you can't teach speed. And there are studies suggesting that children who are naturally slow runners tend to stay relatively slow. They don't quite catch up to those who seem naturally gifted with more fast-twitch fibers. The example of the Danish shot putter, Joachim Olsen, is really illustrative here. A muscle biopsy showed he had an unusually high proportion of these fast-twitch fibers. Knowing this, his coach, Anderson, completely changed his training program, moved away from high-volume, medium-weight lifting towards short bursts of very heavy lifting, and after this tailored approach, his fast-twitch fibers apparently ballooned, as the source puts it, and that contributed significantly to him winning an Olympic medal.
That's a brilliant example, isn't it, of how understanding the specific biology allows for a training approach that really unlocks potential rather than just a generic work harder method.
Exactly. It really underlines that optimal training isn't some one-size-fits-all plan. It needs to be informed by the individual's unique biology. And then, of course, there are the genes themselves. The source describes the human genome as this incredibly complex recipe book, right, with maybe 23,000 genes. And changing just one page, one gene, can affect instructions elsewhere in the book. It acknowledges our understanding of most genes is still quite limited, but it gives examples, like the ACTN3 gene. It's associated with having more fast-twitch fibers, so it's linked to sprinting ability. However, and this is critical, the source immediately pours a bit of cold water on the idea of using genetic tests for talent spotting. It quotes Carl Foster, who very wisely says that the best genetic test right now for speed is a stopwatch.
Yeah, that makes sense. Why bother with an indirect genetic hint when you can just measure the actual outcome directly? Seems much more practical than trying to decode a huge, largely unknown recipe book.
Precisely. And moving beyond the microscopic, you've got the macroscopic hardware, the overall body type. Certain physical structures aren't just helpful. In some elite sports, they seem to be almost necessary preconditions for reaching the very top.
This is where some of those really startling statistics come in, isn't it?
Absolutely. The height premium in the NBA is just extraordinary. The source presents data suggesting that an American man between 20 and 40, who happens to be 7 feet tall, has an incredible 17% chance of currently being in the NBA.
17%.
17%. Just let that sink in. 1 in every 6 or 7 footers in that age group is likely playing professional basketball. Compare that to the general population. A man who's, say, 6'11" to 6'2" has a probability of about 5 in a million. 6'2" to 6'4", it's 20 in a million. Even up at 6'10" to 750, it's only 3.2%. It's such a clear illustration of how one specific physical attribute gives this massive selective advantage at the absolute elite level.
17%. That figure is genuinely hard to get your head around. It completely changes any idea that you can just work hard enough to make it to the NBA if you don't have that fundamental physical gift. What about other body specializations?
Water polo players are another really compelling example. They measured elite Croatian national team players over 2 decades, and they found their average arm lengths had increased significantly by over an inch. That's a rate 5 times greater than you see in the general Croatian male population over the same period. It suggests that as the sport evolved, as the demands increased, players with longer arms better suited for reaching, for leverage in the water, were increasingly selected for the top squads, whilst those with shorter arms were, as the source puts it, weeded out.
So it's almost like a form of natural selection, but happening within that specific athletic group based on the demands of the sport.
A very powerful illustration, yes, of how certain physical traits can become almost non-negotiable requirements at the highest levels. Bone structure is another fascinating aspect they touch on. A study by Cowgill compared the bone density of children from medieval herding communities to modern kids. The herders' children had significantly more robust skeletons. The source uses this great analogy of a muscle bookcase, noting studies suggest a kind of general limit, maybe around 5 kilograms of muscle per kilogram of bone across different athletes. So your inherited bone structure effectively dictates, to some extent, the maximum amount of muscle you can realistically build and support, which influences your suitability for sports with weight classes or those needing serious strength relative to your size.
And the sources even discuss very carefully some broader population-level differences in body type linked to ancestry.
Yes, they do touch on documented physical differences observed, on average, between individuals of African and European descent. Specifically, for a given sitting height, individuals of African or African American ancestry tend to have longer legs relative to their torso length compared to those of European ancestry. A study from Duke and Howard universities used engineering models to look at the potential athletic implications of this. They found this difference typically translates to about a 3% higher average center of mass in Black adults compared to white adults of the same overall height.
And what did the engineering model suggest that difference actually means for athletic performance?
Well, the model indicated this slightly higher center of mass could translate to a theoretical 1.5% advantage in running speed for athletes with that longer leg build. Conversely, athletes with a lower center of mass, which is often associated with relatively shorter legs for their height, gained a theoretical 1.5% advantage in swimming speed. Because maintaining that horizontal body position and reducing drag is so critical in swimming. Now, the source is notably very careful here. It frames this strictly in terms of observed physical findings in engineering models. It highlights the author's explicit warnings against using these findings for any kind of racial stereotyping, emphasizing the huge diversity within all populations. It's presented purely as an example of how quite subtle anatomical differences can have measurable biomechanical consequences that are relevant to specific athletic activities.
It's clear then, isn't it? It's absolutely not just about grinding out 10,000 hours. It's this incredibly complex, dynamic interplay genetics, specific physical biology, the environment, and that dedicated, often very tailored practice. What about trainability itself? The source mentions that even how people respond to practice varies hugely, right?
Absolutely. The sources really stress that trainability is not uniform at all. Individuals respond vastly differently to the exact same training stimulus. And this variation itself appears to have a strong genetic component. Claude Bouchard's seminal studies, looking at sedentary subjects and identical twins, put this into really sharp focus. He put sedentary individuals, or pairs of identical twins, through identical endurance training programs. And he found this massive range in how much their aerobic capacity, their VO2 max, actually improved. It ranged anywhere from virtually zero change, 0%, right up to a doubling of capacity, 100% improvement from the same training.
Wow. So some people are just naturally high responders to endurance training, and others are low responders, even if they put in exactly the same effort.
Precisely. Bouchard's twin studies confirm this. They showed that the variation in response between different pairs of identical twins was 6 to 9 times larger than the variation within a pair, even though genetically identical individuals presumably experience the training stimulus identically from a biological viewpoint. This was later confirmed by the Big Heritage Family Study. The source quotes an editorial commenting on this, noting that for some individuals, their predetermined genetic alphabet soup just may not spell runner. However, and this is a really crucial point underlined heavily in the source material, the bright side is that everyone in the Heritage study benefited from exercise in some health parameter, even the low responders in terms of aerobic fitness. They might not have seen a big jump in their VO2 max, but they typically saw improvements in other vital areas: blood pressure, cholesterol levels, insulin sensitivity. Though, intriguingly, it does note a small number of individuals paradoxically saw improvements in some markers, whilst others, like insulin sensitivity, actually went in the wrong direction. Still, the overall message is positive.
That is such a vital takeaway, isn't it? And it goes way beyond just elite sport. Exercise benefits all of us, just in perhaps profoundly unique, individual ways.
Indeed. And that brings us neatly back to the source's concluding thought on athletic improvement.
Yeah.
It says, to pursue athletic improvement is to embark on a quest in search of the practice plan that suits your inimitable biology. The journey is presented as something deeply personal, deeply complex, extending, as it says, beyond even the illuminating reach of cutting-edge science in its entirety.
That synthesis makes perfect sense. It's this individual quest, marrying effort with your innate potential. Okay, now, pushing the body to these absolute limits that inevitably involves risk, injury, significant health challenges. Let's pivot now to our second source. This one delves into the world of orthopedic sports medicine and looks towards its future. What does this material tell us about the sheer physical toll athletes endure and how the body, or maybe the mind, sometimes manages to push through it?
Well, the sources certainly highlight the extreme physical demands and also the remarkable capacity of some athletes to tolerate pain. We hear these anecdotes, don't we? Like the American football player Jerome Bettis playing a game with a broken nose, stuffing cotton wool up his nostrils, which then apparently went down into his stomach, causing severe pain. Or the MMA fighter Tim Sylvia continuing a fight with a clearly shattered arm, only really feeling the intense agony after the fight was stopped.
Those are incredible stories, just pushing through what sounds like unbearable pain.
And there's research cited, like Sternberg's study on athletes, it provides some insight. It found that elite athletes were actually less sensitive to pain than non-athletes, even before they experienced any acute injury or stress. And furthermore, that pain sensitivity decreased even more on game day itself. This is linked to the physiological fight-or-flight response. Essentially, the brain actively inhibits pain perception when you're under acute stress or perceive a threat, allowing you to keep functioning. The source describes this ability to withstand pain as another braid of nature and nurture. Likely involves both an inherent predisposition and some psychological conditioning.
Right, so a mix of maybe innate resilience and that learned mental toughness.
Yes. The sources also touch on innate factors that influence your susceptibility to injury itself. Variations in certain collagen genes, specifically COL1A1 and COL5A1, are mentioned, seem to influence the flexibility and strength of connective tissues, like your tendons and ligaments. And that could potentially affect an individual's risk of getting injured. The source notes quite rightly you can't change your DNA. But knowing about these predispositions could potentially inform decisions about, say, modifying training or doing specific rehabilitation exercises to strengthen potentially vulnerable areas.
So it's a genetic predisposition perhaps, but not necessarily an unavoidable destiny, more about managing risk.
Correct. It's about understanding potential risk factors. And then, of course, there are serious, sometimes tragic health conditions that can affect athletes, like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or HCM. This condition is powerfully illustrated by the really tragic story of Kevin, who suffered sudden cardiac death during a game. His autopsy revealed this massively enlarged heart, 554 grams, compared to an average adult heart weight of maybe 300 grams. HCM is often genetic, typically inherited in an autosomal dominant pattern, which means there's a 50% chance of a child inheriting it if one parent has the faulty gene. The source mentions that 18 different genes and over 1,400 specific mutations have now been identified in databases linked to HCM. Missense mutations, where a single change in the DNA sequence leads to a different amino acid in the protein, seem to be common. But the source really highlights the profound difficulty in predicting which individuals with HCM are at the highest risk of sudden death, and also the clinical challenge of sometimes distinguishing the pathological heart enlargement in HCM from the normal, healthy physiological enlargement, the athlete's heart, that happens with regular intense training. A heart murmur, which can be a sign of HCM, might even disappear when an athlete gets out of shape, which complicates diagnosis even further.
That's a terrifyingly fine line, isn't it? Between healthy adaptation and a dangerous underlying condition. Okay, turning to the orthopedic sports medicine source more broadly now. What are some of the main challenges or perhaps worries it raises about the field itself, both now and looking ahead?
Well, the source offers quite a critical perspective on the field, it has to be said. One key worry, articulated by Stephen, is this perceived lack of robust science, underpinning quite a lot of standard orthopedic procedures and clinical decisions. There's a sense that clinical opinions and practices are often based more on tradition or anecdote or maybe limited studies rather than the really rigorous, high-quality scientific evidence that should be the foundation. There's a clear call for developing more objective measurement techniques to properly evaluate interventions and outcomes.
So a case of doing things because that's how they've always been done rather than because they've been definitively proven to be the absolute best approach.
That seems to be the core concern. Yes, the need to really elevate the scientific rigor. Closely related to that is the issue of research reliability and reproducibility. The source discusses the challenges inherent in interpreting complex data. It cites this quite striking Nature study where 29 independent research teams were given the exact same data set from football matches. They were asked to analyze it, even on a seemingly straightforward question, like whether players with darker skin received more red cards, and the 29 teams came to different conclusions from the same data.
Wow. That really highlights the subjective element in analysis, doesn't it?
It does, and the source also mentions, well-publicized issues with replicating findings, and even outright scientific fraud, referencing examples like retractions from Harvard or the Andrew Wakefield case. It stresses that trust and integrity are absolutely fundamental for the scientific community to function properly.
If different teams looking at the same data get different answers, how can clinicians confidently translate research into practice? That must be a real challenge.
It certainly underlines the difficulties in building a truly reliable evidence base and the importance of critically evaluating research. The source also raises some quite pointed critiques about surgical outcomes themselves. Johnson is quoted expressing concern that key metrics, things like failure rates, re-injury rates, the ability of patients to get back to their pre-injury level and position after common procedure like ACL reconstruction, haven't really seen significant improvement over the last 20 years.
20 years with limited significant improvement in key outcomes. That is quite a damning critique of standard practice, isn't it?
It is, yes. Johnson is quoted as saying quite bluntly, "We are not as good as we think we are," and describes some commonly used procedures, like taking a hamstring graft for an ACL reconstruction, as ripping out your hamstrings and potentially barbaric. Challenges also persist, apparently, in accurately understanding and treating partial ACL tears, and also in reliably assessing knee laxity or instability, which can be quite subjective.
These sound like really significant, quite fundamental challenges for the field. Looking ahead then, how do major trends like technology and maybe that increasing focus on prevention factor into the future of athlete care, according to these sources?
Technology, especially digitalization and the rise of AI, is definitely presented as a major force shaping the future. It's seen as both a potential help and perhaps a disruptive force. AI has shown really impressive capabilities, hasn't it? For example, greater accuracy than humans in interpreting medical images, like in radiology. The implication discussed is that AI can increasingly automate tasks that involve recognizing predictable patterns, and that could potentially make parts of a surgeon's traditional role, well, redundant. So to remain relevant, indispensable even, surgeons need to demonstrate the unique value of the human factor. Maybe that's handling highly unpredictable surgical situations, making complex judgments that go beyond pattern recognition, navigating tricky patient interactions. The source suggests surgeons must embrace rather than shun technology. They need to actively engage with it, help guide its development, ensure it serves patient interests.
So technology isn't just a tool anymore, it's actually changing the fundamental landscape of practice, and practitioners need to adapt.
Exactly. It's a dynamic relationship. There are also commercial and sort of populist pressures influencing the field. Increased connectivity, social media. It creates pressure on surgeons to engage in self-promotion. The phrase advertise or die is actually used. And that might lead to favoring techniques that are easily marketed or popular with the public, even if the solid evidence for their superiority isn't really there yet. This raises concerns about whether commercial interests or the pressure to follow trends might risk overshadowing the primary focus, which should always be the patient's best interest. The source contrasts this with concepts like France's precautionary principle, which really prioritizes patient safety, but can sometimes be seen as slowing down innovation because it demands extensive proof before adopting new things.
That tension between the business side of medicine, the drive to innovate, and that core principle of patient safety must be a constant balancing act.
It's a significant one, certainly. Biologic and regenerative medicine is another area discussed. Huge promise, isn't it? The idea of harnessing the body's own abilities to heal and regenerate tissue. However, the source highlights a pretty considerable gap between that exciting promise and the currently proven efficacy for many conditions. It points out this concerning trend where patients might spend significant sums of money, sometimes millions, on unproven treatments, things like stem cell injections, plasma therapies, often for conditions where established, evidence-based treatments already exist. And meanwhile, legitimate researchers trying to do the necessary rigorous studies to actually validate these new therapies often struggle to get the funding and support they need.
Right, so there's a risk of a rush to market with potentially untested therapies before the science is really solid.
That seems to be the dynamic described, yes, creating both hope and, unfortunately, potential exploitation. Even the environmental impact of surgery gets a mention. The significant amount of waste generated by procedures cited as around 9 kilograms for a hip arthroscopy, or a hefty 15 kilograms for a total knee replacement. This raises a growing awareness and the need to address the environmental footprint of surgical practice, looking for ways to reduce waste, maybe reuse materials where possible.
That's a perspective on surgery you don't often hear talked about, is it? Really broadening the scope of responsibility.
It reflects a broader, evolving understanding of the medical profession's role, I think. Injury prevention is also a major theme, especially in professional sports. We hear about clubs like Manchester United investing heavily, reportedly £30 million in prevention programs. Now, this investment naturally raises questions. Are athletes being pushed harder than ever before? And are surgeons, by being able to fix injuries, perhaps inadvertently becoming complicit in an environment that puts athletes at higher risk in the first place, pushing them towards breaking point? The source references the Olympic motto, faster, higher, stronger, and asks whether this relentless pursuit pushes athletes to their absolute limits and then potentially discards them when they inevitably break down. It notes a striking lack of international advocacy for injury prevention, despite the enormous societal burden of conditions like knee osteoarthritis. It argues that medical societies have a professional responsibility that goes beyond just treating the injured. It includes actively promoting and advocating for preventative measures.
So prevention isn't just about protecting the individual athlete, it's about managing a huge long-term public health issue.
Exactly. It's presented as a really critical area for future focus. Finally, the source discusses the importance of having robust safety processes in surgery. It introduces this concept of the Gruyere, or Emmental theory, Swiss cheese.
Yes.
The idea is using layers of relatively simple checks and checklists confirmed by multiple people, for example, to create redundant safety barriers, like the holes in slices of Swiss cheese. If the holes in multiple slices don't line up, you can't see straight through. It's about making it much less likely for several small errors to combine and lead to a major incident. It draws parallels with safety protocols in high-reliability industries, like aviation. The source stresses the importance of really embedding these processes, ensuring clear communication, explaining why these steps are necessary, and maintaining dignity and a non-punitive culture when errors do happen so people feel safe reporting them and everyone can learn.
Simple, layered checks, like adding more slices of cheese so the holes don't align. That's a really practical way of thinking about reducing errors.
Precisely. It's about process and it's about culture.
Okay, let's wrap up with a quick lightning round. Some sharp points based on all this rich material. First up, according to the source, what's a simple tool that's currently better than fancy genetic testing for assessing athletic potential like speed?
A stopwatch. Simple as that.
Right. And a key framework mentioned for improving safety in complex procedures like surgery.
That would be the Gruyere or Emmental theory, those layered checklists, and having a robust process.
And finally, one perhaps surprising but also quite encouraging, finding about exercise benefits, even for those who don't seem to have the innate biology for elite performance.
That even the so-called low responders people who show minimal or maybe no improvement in aerobic fitness from a training program still benefit in other really crucial health areas. Things like blood pressure, cholesterol, insulin sensitivity. Exercise provides unique benefits for absolutely everyone, regardless of their genetic potential for hitting those performance peaks.
That finding about the universal, albeit unique, benefits from exercise. That's a really powerful message from this material, isn't it? Okay, let's just recap a few key takeaways for you, our listener, from this deep dive. First, becoming an elite athlete. It's far from a simple formula. It's a profoundly complex interaction. It involves dedicated, often highly tailored practice and your innate biology. Success right at the top often demands specific physical hardware and structure, everything from muscle fiber type, bone density, right down to limb length proportions alongside that relentless effort. It's definitely not just about the 10,000 hours. It's about applying those hours effectively to the biology you actually have. Second, the field of orthopedic sports medicine, whilst it's advancing, faces some significant self-acknowledged challenges. These include that critical need for more robust, more trustworthy research and demonstrating real improvements in surgical outcomes over time, as well as navigating the complex ethical questions raised by new technology, commercial pressures, and that looming threat of antibiotic resistance. Third, the material presents injury prevention not just as sensible practice, but actually as a professional responsibility for medical societies and surgeons. This is particularly important given the potential limitations and the inherent risks of surgical intervention, plus the wider societal health burden from conditions like osteoarthritis. And finally, maybe the most universally relevant point. The sources strongly suggest that exercise benefits everyone, but in unique ways. Regardless of whether you happen to possess the specific innate biology needed to become an Olympic champion or a top professional athlete, your body will respond. It will benefit potentially just in different ways or different parameters than you might initially expect if you only focus on performance numbers. If you found this deep dive valuable and insightful, please do take just a moment to rate and share the show so others can discover it too. Thank you, Prof. Mo Imam, for expertly navigating us through these really rich and thought-provoking sources today.
It was a genuine pleasure. A truly fascinating exploration, wasn't it? That intersection of human potential, biology, and medicine.
And for you, our listener, here's a final thought to perhaps mull over. Building on that idea of individual trainability and unique benefits. Given that we know the response to exercise is so profoundly varied from person to person, and yet everyone benefits in some specific way, how can we better personalize our approaches to physical activity? Whether it's for ourselves, for our teams, maybe even within broader public health initiatives. How do we shift the focus away from what can be a demoralizing one-size-fits-all performance model towards one that really celebrates and leverages the specific unique benefits that are unlocked for each individual person? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.